Hello, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and today we're going to talk about the two megapixel monsters that are on the scene. The first one, the Canon 5DS, ranking at 50 megapixels, and the second, the Sony A7RII at 42 megapixels. Now both of these cameras are very nice, but what we're going to do is we're going to put them head to head in a little friendly competition, we'll call it that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at them spec for spec. We're just going to put them right next to each other and say, okay, what do you got, what do you got? See what the difference is. Then we're going to look at some practical application like handling the camera, battery life, menu systems. The third thing we're going to look at is the actual raw files. Now I field tested these cameras, both of them, pretty extensively, and I was really looking at number one, ISO. Now, how did these two monsters rank in the ISO department? Number two, the 5-axis image stabilization that's in the Sony A7RII versus the non-stabilized 5DS, and the dynamic range that's contained in both of those images. After that, we're going to go into the reports, some different places that have reports on these like DxOMark and DP Review, and compare them head to head so you know exactly what you're looking at with these two beasts. And then I'm going to give you my final thoughts on what I think about these two cameras. So let's go ahead and jump in because we got a lot to talk about with these two. Okay, let's start by taking a look at the Canon 5DS spec sheet. This camera was released in February of 2015, so just about a year ago. The sensor type is a full frame, so it's not crop sensor, you're getting a 35mm equivalent. Camera type is a DSLR, that means it does have a reflex mirror inside the camera body, which we will discuss later about the function of this camera. The price is about $3,700 retail. Megapixel count 50.6. Frames per second 5, dynamic range points 12.4, and a display fixed. That LCD screen does not move, and it has 61 autofocus points, and the lens mount is the Canon EF mount. So if you're looking for lenses for this, any EF lenses will be fine for this. No EFS, okay? Now let's look at the Sony A7RII spec sheet. Date of release, June 2015. Sensor type, full frame, again, 35mm equivalent, no crop factor here. Camera type is a mirrorless camera. Again, we'll talk about the function of that later. Priced at about $3,200 retail. Megapixel count 42.4, 5 frames per second. Dynamic range 13.9 points. That's an impressive 13.9 points. And we will discuss exactly what this means for you in the future here. Tilting LCD, that means that LCD monitor does pull off the back of that camera, slightly tilts up and down so that you can get better low angle shots without having to break your back when you're getting down on that tripod. 399 impressive autofocus points, and it takes the Sony E-mount. So what are the differences, the stark differences in these cameras right off the bat? Well, 5 months in age. The Sony A7RII is about 5 years younger than the Canon E5DS. Not that much of a difference in age when it comes to cameras, I guess. There's a $500 difference. So you're gonna be spending a little bit more on the Canon. 8.2 megapixels. The Canon does have much more megapixels. 8.2. At some point you're like, 8.2 is not that much, but that in the past that used to be an entire camera's worth of megapixels. Okay, so let's put that in perspective here. Quite a bit more megapixels. Fixed versus tilting LCD screen. That fixed LCD screen, like I said before, is great for low angle shots. 338 more autofocus points. As if 61 autofocus points wasn't enough, the Sony A7RII contains 399. That is impressive. And lens selection. Well, Canon does have many more lenses in their product line. They've been around for much longer and creating this stuff for a lot longer, so they do have a lot more selection when it comes to lenses. However, more and more lenses are being made for the Sony cameras by different manufacturers, from Sigma to Zeiss and even Sony themselves, just like you see with the Canon lenses. So there are more lenses that are coming out for the Sonys, making that less and less of a problem. There is a 1 pound difference in weight with the Sony, and we'll discuss this further. The Sony has 1.5 more points of dynamic range, and we'll discuss exactly what this means for you as we go through this. So just keep that thought in your mind, that this has 1.5 more points of dynamic range. The Sony supports the use of in-camera apps, which is really neat. You can actually download apps for that camera right into the camera and access them through the camera so that you can create, say, a time lapse or something. It turns your camera into an intervalometer, which is pretty neat. Dual card slots. The Canon does have dual card slots. You can put a compact flash in there or an SD card, which is really nice. Battery life. Well, the Canon wins battery life hands down. But then we get into 4K video recording. The Sony does have the capability to record 4K video, which can be very nice if you are a video enthusiast. So let's talk about some controlled elements for this. As we go through all of these images that I'm going to show you, the controlled elements here were, I used both of the native lenses for both of these cameras. So the Canon 16 to 35 millimeter lens, I used that. And I also used the Zeiss 16 to 35 millimeter lens for the Sony. So both cameras had native lenses on them. They did not have an adapter. Both cameras operated with a lens that would be compatible with them. I used all the same or as close as I could possibly get settings for each of the individual cameras. There might have been some meter reading errors that happened in the process. I was taking images in various places where there were lots of people to put these cameras to the test. So I tried to get their settings as close as I possibly could to one another so I could give them a fair comparison. I do want to tell you that all of these tests were conducted from a landscape photographer's perspective. I am a landscape photographer, so I think about things in terms of my landscape photography or my cityscape photography. I don't think about them in terms of portrait work or maybe something like product photography or sports. Okay, so keep that in mind. Practical application. We're going to talk about weight, battery life, menu system, and the viewfinder. These are all four very important things that I noticed as I was using these cameras. So when we talk about weight, the Canon comes in at 58 ounces, where the Sony comes in at 43 ounces. In American terms, that's 3.6 pounds for the Canon and 2.69 pounds for the Sony. So it's almost a whole pound difference. In terms of kilograms, we're looking at 1.64 kilograms as opposed to 1.22 kilograms, which might not seem like that big of a deal, but 1 pound can make a very big difference over the course of a long day of shooting. Let's say you're out 8 hours a day, walking the landscape. You've got this attached to a tripod. Maybe it's over your shoulder. Maybe it's in your camera bag. However that may be, that 1 pound of difference does make quite a bit of difference as you shoot with these cameras. Also think about the fact that if a camera is heavier and you're trying to hand hold your shots, that is going to influence some camera shake. So if the lighter the camera, the easier it is to hand hold without having too much issue. Battery life. From all the specs that I found on the internet, the lovely internet, the Canon has 700 shots and the Sony 340 shots. However, I will tell you this, that during my tests with the Sony, I shot 120 images and my battery was depleted down to 0, to the point that I had to take it out and put a new one in. Obviously, battery life depends on a lot of things. How old is this battery? Where did this battery come from? When was its last charge? Was it a fresh charge? There's many different things that can be a variable when it comes to the battery life of our camera. The battery that I was using was a Sony battery. It was not an off-brand battery. It was a Sony battery. I had charged it the night before, put it in the camera the next morning, and went out and I shot. I shot from about, I'd say 10:30 in the morning until about 6 o'clock at night before I had to change the battery. So we're looking at 8 hours, 120 shots. I was doing a lot of testing with 3 different cameras. But to me, 120 shots just doesn't seem like a very good battery life at all. Now, I'll also admit that I didn't even take very many shots with the 5DS because I was, I guess, in love with this little Sony A7RII. So I never got to the end of the battery life on the Canon, not even close. But after 120 shots, with any of these Sonys, I know this from the A6000 also, take many batteries with you because they soak through batteries like you wouldn't believe. And now on to the menu system. Now, I personally tend to be more of a Canon person when it comes to the menu system. I find it less clunky. It's a lot easier to read. If you look at these two camera bodies right here, this is the Canons. When you press this quick menu button right here, it brings you into this menu. It doesn't show your picture right there. It just shows you this menu. It's very easy to read. You know exactly what settings need to be changed, and you can do it very quickly on the fly with this directional wheel here. You got your directional button here, your directional wheel here, and your set button here. Same with the Canon 60 and the 5DS. Now over here on your Sony A6000, this is your quick menu. You press the function button, and this is one of the 2 quick menus that you can have selected. This quick menu, you'll see the image in the background, and this is an overlay over top of it. It can be very convoluted, and it's rather difficult to see the settings on your camera that way. The other one does take a full screen view, kind of like this one, but it's very convoluted. There's all kinds of information all over the place. I've been using the Canon cameras for about 3 years, so I am very adapted to the Canon menu system. The Sonys I've been using for a little over a year and a half, and I'm still not quite there yet. I just can't wrap my head around their menu system. So I definitely prefer the Canon menu system and the Canon operation of buttons. Everything just seems a little bit more logical to me. However, this might be logical to somebody else and this illogical. This is where a certain camera will mind meld with you at some point. So for me, I'm more comfortable with the Canon menu system. So let's talk about the viewfinders now. The viewfinder on the Canon is a DSLR camera. So the way the viewfinder works is the image or the light comes in through the aperture in your lens. It bounces off of a reflex mirror into a pentaprism and then into your eye so that you get an optical picture of what it is that you're looking at. As soon as you click the shutter, this reflex mirror goes up, the shutters open, and the light hits the sensor and records the image. So now with the Sony, it is a mirrorless camera. So what that means is the light enters the lens through the aperture and hits the sensor. Once the light hits the sensor, that picture is then represented on the electronic viewfinder, or EVF. So what you see on the sensor is what you see in your eye. Now, each of these has their own benefits. With the Canon, you're going to get a clearer picture. And I say that because you're looking through a mirror image. You're seeing a mirrored image of something. So it's a clearer picture. It definitely is clear. It's not pixelated because it's not an electronic viewfinder. You're looking at the same representation of cameras that we've seen over the past century or so. Okay. You're going to have an extended battery life when you do not have an electronic viewfinder because there's not two pieces of electronics that need to work. Now with the mirrorless world, what you see in the viewfinder is what the sensor sees. You can also do in-viewfinder magnification. So what this means is what you see in that viewfinder is exactly what your sensor is seeing. So if the image is underexposed and you actually see that underexposure in your viewfinder, so after you take your picture, what you saw in your viewfinder, what you saw on the back of your LCD screen are going to match each other. Unlike what happens with a DSLR where you look through that optical picture, you take the picture and then you get a dark picture. Well, it's because you're not seeing exactly what your sensor sees, okay? You get in viewfinder magnification, which means you can have that viewfinder up to your eye. You can double click a button. I usually set the little mirror, the C1 button on top of the camera to do that. And you can zoom in up to 10 times into an object. So as you're sitting there with that viewfinder in front of your eye, you can press that button twice, zoom in to exactly what it is that you want to get it in focus and take the picture. It doesn't take a zoomed in picture though. It just allows you to zoom in so that you can get the best, most accurate focusing by magnifying that in the viewfinder, which is a very powerful technique. It also has something called focus peaking. And that focus peaking is it'll actually put these overlays, these little line work overlays over top of the image as you see it in your viewfinder. When you see that, that means that typically is going to be the area that's in focus. Now, it's just a guideline. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be in focus. So you definitely have to double check that. But that focus peaking can actually be a very powerful asset also when you're shooting in any environment, whether that's a portrait work or landscape work. So now that we've talked about some of the specs, the head-to-head specs, and we've also gone into some of the practical application, let's look at some of the raw files that come from these cameras. Okay, so we aren't looking at anything special here. Both of these images did not go through any special treatment when it came to post-processing. I snapped the shots, put them straight out of camera, brought them right into Adobe Camera Raw, and just layered them on top of each other. And the point of this is that I want to tell you that both of these cameras are beautiful. They are tack sharp. Look, we are zoomed in at 200% and look at how sharp this building is for the Canon and how sharp it is for the Sony. Both of these cameras very well perform with the perfect exposure. But that's not the point of what I'm trying to show you today. What I'm trying to show you is that you can't really test the limits of a RAW file or of a camera for that matter until you put them in a stressful situation. Anytime you have perfect exposure, it's really easy. But put those files, those RAW files and those cameras to the test in something difficult, in a difficult environment to shoot. That's when you start to see those sensors shine. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so first things first, let's talk ISO. So first one here. This is the ISO 1600. The basic setup was I was standing in the middle of this hall at the Nelson Atkins Museum. I took a picture and that was about it. Swapped cameras, took another picture, changed the ISOs, and did that several times repeatedly. So let's look at ISO 1600. We'll zoom in right in here to the figure. This that you're looking at right now is the Canon image. All right, this is ISO 1600. That's actually pretty good for ISO 1600. I think my very first digital camera looked like this at ISO 100. So ISO 1600, both of these cameras can hold their own. They are quite beastly in that function. Now, if you look at the background here, you'll see that the Sony looks like it's retaining a little bit more detail. They were both focused on the same object, both focused the same way. My assumption is that the stabilization here in the camera is better than the stabilization here in the lens. But looking at noise, we zoom out here, we zoom in maybe up here to the darker areas. Here's the Sony, here's the Canon. They both look very good. So let's go ahead and move on to ISO 6400. Again, we'll zoom into the figure in the front. As we zoom in, we look at the Canon. This is the Canon one on the front. And then now we have the Sony. The Canon has a little bit smoother noise. It's got a little bit less of a grain, hard cut edge on it like the Sony noise does, which what this does, it makes it a little bit easier to reduce noise. So while ISO is a key factor, it's not just getting the shot, it's how well can that noise be reduced. Okay, we'll go up into the shadows again here and look at the shadows here at about 113% there. Here's the Canon. Here's the Sony. Look at the difference. Canon, Sony. Again, a little bit cleaner of a noise. And this was the Sony uncompressed RAW file that I was using for this. So looking at ISO 12800, we'll zoom in. We got the Canon in the front, and now we have the Sony in the back. Okay. So looking at these, as you can see, at 12,800, which is a very high ISO, I would never really find myself at that ISO that I know of at this point, in 2016, that is. You never know. Maybe cameras will get better, and 12,800 will be the new 100. Who knows? Anyway, Canon at 12,800 still looks pretty darn good. That's better than my Canon 6D right now at, say, ISO 2400 or something like that. So that's pretty impressive. We'll zoom up here to the shadows. Canon, Sony, Canon, Sony. Now, I was saying before that the noise reduction here, it does make a difference which one you have. So this is the Canon with reduced noise at 12,800, and this is the Sony with reduced noise at 12,800. We zoom in here, look at the noise reduction difference. Here's the Sony, here's the Canon. The Canon one, everything's a little bit smoother. I reduced the noise very mildly in Adobe Camera Raw. And these 12,800 pictures are still relatively usable. I was actually pretty impressed. So let's go ahead and look in the shadows here. Like I said before, the Sony noise seems to be a little bit more crisp, more harsh, more cut. All right, so there's the Sony and there's the Canon. Canon cleaned up very well. So all noise is not the same. All ISOs are not the same. Even though they are differently sensitive on the image, I would say that here, when it comes to ISO sensitivity, above 1600, Canon starts to really shine in that department. And so this photograph may not appear special at all to you. It's the inside of the Kaufman Center in Kansas City. Beautiful, beautiful place to shoot on the outside and the inside. I ended up coming at the end of a tour and they let me shoot here, which is very awesome. Let's zoom around here and look. Look at this photograph. May not seem too impressive to you, all right? But what if I told you that this was 1/6 of a second at ISO 2000? So to me, that's pretty impressive. 1/6 of a second at ISO 2000. There's no camera shake from me holding the camera. I wasn't braced against a wall. This is straight out of the camera. 1/6 of a second, ISO 2000. I was blown away, actually, because I haven't seen anything quite like this before. I didn't even bother to do this with the Canon because it does not have the 5-axis stabilization. I wanted to get the shot. I didn't have much time to do it, so what did I grab? I grabbed the camera that I knew would get it, and that was the Sony in this case. Awesome, hands down, 5-axis stabilization really shines in this camera. Okay, so let's talk dynamic range now. So like I said before, if you really want to stress a RAW file and see exactly what it can do, you got to put it in a stressful situation. So I shot both of these cameras, the Sony and the Canon, at -5 exposure values. All right, so I got the right exposure and then dropped both of them -5 EV. So let's go and press auto on this. Auto will usually pretty much pick up what's wrong with the photo. So now both of these images, I'm just going to open them right in Photoshop. The reason why I open these images in Photoshop is because it takes a lot less time to buffer when you're trying to see those situations. In Adobe Camera Raw, it has to take some buffering time to do that. So this is the Canon and this is the Sony. Now, while things are a little bit more washed away, I should say, here it looks like there might be a little bit more detail in there. The recovery from the -5 exposure values is really hurting this Canon image. It's getting really soft and it's really affecting it. But the Sony holds its ground pretty well. That's where dynamic range can be really important. Dynamic range, the more points of dynamic range, the more exploitation you have, the farther you can take that RAW file. So me, I'm a HDR photographer. I like to exploit that dynamic range as far as I can get it. If there's not a lot of dynamic range to begin with, there's not a lot of information to exploit. All right, it's kind of like an interrogation. The Sony has a lot more information for me to beat out of it. That's exactly what happens here. Very, very powerful. That 1.5 stops of dynamic range makes a huge difference in these images. There are a couple places that I like to go when I'm researching cameras. One of them is lovely Amazon. All right, so here I am in Amazon. That item in my cart is not a Sony A7RII. So I'm going to click on this EOS 5DS. Okay, so as you click here, scroll all the way down, and what Amazon has done is they've put the DP review scores right here for most of the cameras. Not all of them, but some of the cameras you'll find that in there. So for the A7RII and the 5DS, they have them in there. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've put them right on top of each other. So here's the Sony, here's the Canon right on top of each other. I took out one line called connectivity because the connectivity line wasn't there for both cameras. And you'll see that what you can do with this is if you take this Sony one and you turn this to pin light. All right, so if they're both on top of each other and you turn this to pin light, this will tell you where both cameras are better than the other. The build quality of the Canon is better. So here's where Sony is losing out on build quality, ergonomics, and those are very true with what I would think too. Features, I think the Sony has a lot more features than the Canon does. Metering and focus accuracy, I would also agree there. Image quality, raw, definitely. I didn't shoot these in JPEG because I don't shoot JPEG, but you can see that anything that has this like pastel blue will be the Sony, where the Sony is, I guess, beating the Canon, and anything where you've got this like faded blue is where it's missing and not quite competing with the Canon. ISO performance, it says that Sony does better, but in my tests, I found that I liked the Canon better. I thought it cleaned up a lot easier than the Sony. So I don't know, that's just my personal preference, I guess, my opinion based off of not just that test, but several ISO tests that I did. Viewfinder and screen rating, I'm not quite sure why the Canon's getting higher ranked than this. It's probably because the actual LCD screen is a lot better on the Canon. I noticed that when I was live view focusing on both of those cameras, the one on the Canon had a much sharper live view on the actual LCD screen, but that doesn't go with the viewfinder. The viewfinder is still going to be that optical on the Canon as opposed to the Sony. Performance-wise, I would say that maybe the Canon does outperform it. Definitely in battery life, ISO, maybe prolonged use, maybe that's the case. The movie video mode, Sony's got it beat there almost by double. That's because of the 4K video and value. You're getting a lot more camera for this. Talking to a guy at the Weston Brewery the other day, and he knew cameras too, and he says, you know, that Sony A7RII looks really nice. I was like, you know, he said, but it's expensive. I was like, yeah, but you know, it's kind of like getting a Corvette for $10,000. Brand new Corvette off the lot for $10,000. Yeah, it's expensive, but what you're getting in it is a lot of value. So let's take a look at DxOMark too, because that's another place that I like to go. So one of the things I really like about DxOMark is you can pick your cameras here. You can say, okay, I want Canon and I want Sony. So I'm gonna go and press go. You can even give it a date range and a price range too. Okay, so I'll click on this A7RII, which is right at the top. It's the newest Sony, and then scroll down until I find the Canon 5DS and add that one too. You can add multiple cameras, so I can even go down and add my Canon 6D here. So my Canon 6D compared to these other cameras, and I can go to view comparison. In this comparison chart, you're going to see a couple things. You're going to see the overall score. So the Sony scores a 98, the Canon 5DS an 87, and the 6D an 82. You can then look at the color depth of that RAW file, 26 bits as opposed to 24.7. So the Sony's winning there. This is one of those places that I come to see exactly how one camera compares to another when it comes to the actual specs. Then you go to the specifications. You can look at how these two cameras compare side by side with all their different specs, and go into the measurements and even check things like ISO sensitivity. So let's take a look at dynamic range, one of my favorites. So how do you read this chart? Well, here it has all of your different exposure bits of information. So that 13.9 EV dynamic range, you get all of that at ISO 100. Well, the Canon 6D and the 5DS are not capable of getting 14 because they don't even have that much in there, right? So that's what you're getting with these cameras at ISO 100. So the optimal dynamic range comes at the optimal or lowest ISO. As this chart goes, you can see that as the ISO increases, the exposure value decreases. Here's the interesting part. The 5DS, a newer camera, looking at this, the 6D and the 5DS, the 6D actually starts to outperform even the 5DS at ISOs of 1100 or so on the DxO Mark scale. So during their tests, this is what they uncovered. Again, you have to do your own tests, but looking at these types of dynamic tests, you can find more information than just somebody's review online and what their personal thoughts are. So take my thoughts away from this whole review and look at some of the real nitty-gritty information like this. You can go into even tonal range and color sensitivity, both on screen and on print. Very valuable information here, okay? So be sure to look at things like this when you're comparing and contrasting your cameras, because you might find some really shocking and interesting results when you do this. All right, so we've had a chance to take a look at both of these cameras pretty up close. We looked at spec for spec, we looked at some practical application, we also took a look at some RAW files. So what are my final thoughts? Well, my final thoughts are, no matter what hobby you work in, you're always looking for what the best of the best can bring you. When the latest and greatest comes out and hits the streets, everyone always thinks, okay, well, do I really need that? How can I justify that? Will that make my life better? I do a lot of research when it comes to this stuff. Even a year ago, I was looking at switching over to the Sony A7RII, and one of the things I did was I compared the A6000 with the Canon 6D. It's been a year and I still haven't fully jumped into the whole mirrorless system. But after looking at these two cameras, I really strongly think that I'll be jumping in with the Sony A7RII probably in 2016. I still have to do some more research and convince myself that it's right for me. But let's take a look at some reasons why. Canon might have some great lenses. It's got a great series of lenses. They have an awesome menu system. I've always enjoyed the Canon menu system. The other thing about Canon that I really enjoy is the trusted brand. It's been around forever. You know, Sony just kind of came on the streets with these cameras recently and has been taking the industry by storm, where they used to be kind of like a sleeper company. So Canon's been a trusted brand. It's been a brand that I've followed for a while. Does that necessarily mean that I'm not going to jump ship now? I don't know. Battery life. Canon has a much better battery life. So the Sony's $500 less. If I wanted to get a battery grip, I could put a battery grip on it and still be pretty close to the Canon's price if I wanted to upgrade from my 6D to one of these cameras. The Sony's still looking pretty good for me. With that battery grip, it actually does add quite a bit of battery life there. Not just what you would think is it would just add double the battery life, but it actually adds a little bit more than that. I'm testing that with my A6000 right now. Lenses. I can put any type of adapter on my Sony cameras and get my lenses that I already have for Canon, so that's kind of out. The flip out LCD. Sony has Canon beat on that one. I really do enjoy that, especially because I do a lot of low-level landscape photography, and I am very often laying on the ground with my camera, and it gets kind of uncomfortable and I get dirty. So as people get older, that's a lot more difficult. On the workshops that I'm at, when I do those low-level stuff and people don't have a flip-out LCD, they opt not to take the shot because getting up for them might be more difficult. Well, that's something to think about. 4K video. I'm not sure if you're a video person. I'm not that big on video either, but the Sony shoots 4K video. The Canon doesn't. That's really important for some people. And one of the most important things, the electronic viewfinder, the ability to actually look through your viewfinder, zoom in a couple times and focus right on that object that you want, make it perfect right inside that viewfinder, is critical for making awesome photographs. and making sure that you get them in focus. Let's talk about some other things. The dynamic range in the Sony. It's got 1.5 more points of dynamic range, which, as you saw in the video, may not make a difference with a perfectly exposed photograph, but it will make a ton of difference when it comes to maybe an underexposed photo, or taking that single exposure and really exploiting the dynamic range as far as you can to get the shot that you want. And last but not least, this is something I'm really diving in now with my Sony a6000, the apps. The apps that you can get in camera built right into the Sony A7R II and the Sony series is awesome. I have the time-lapse app. Basically, it turns your whole camera into an intervalometer that will take time-lapse photos and videos very well and very easily, where you can either get the video from it, you can get the video and the images, or you can get just the images, so you can create some amazing time lapses really easily with these cameras. So when it comes down to it for me, it's not necessarily about the money for me. Yeah, $3,000 plus is not something to sneeze at. It comes down to what can these cameras do for me. I know for a fact they aren't going to make me a better photographer, because no camera is going to make you a better photographer. But what do I need? What do I want? How do I shoot? And can I justify the frequency of use versus the high expense? Those are things that I battle with, and I think all of us battle with in any hobby. So thank you very much for watching this. If you liked it, please comment, share, drop me a line. Did you get an A7R II? Did you get an A7 II? That's another one I'm thinking about. Have you converted from DSLR to mirrorless? This is a hot topic item right now, so I want to hear your thoughts on it and how it's helped you. And please don't forget to subscribe, because videos like this come out every Friday. Sometimes they're gear and review related. Other times they are tutorial based in Photoshop or Photomatix or Topaz Labs. So if you subscribe, you'll actually get an email every time one of my videos comes out right into your inbox, so that you can get to it first. Again, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and thank you for watching this. I really sincerely hope this helps you with your battle with the whole DSLR to mirrorless transition, because I'm really, really teetering on that edge. Have a good one.